Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Beyond the Frame podcast. I'm Nicole Venegas, an undergraduate politics major at Occidental College, and today we're going to be diving deep into the concept of intersectionality. This episode is geared towards college students, especially those in STEM fields, who may not have had the opportunity to take a theory course where terms like intersectionality are introduced. The goal today is to unpack what intersectionality is. We're going to look at its political importance, how it helps us analyze power structures, and how incorporating intersectionality can provide better political and liberatory strategies. So without further ado, let's get into it. So first things first, what is intersectionality? Intersectionality is the idea that different social factors such as race, gender, class, and sexuality intersect and compound to create a person's unique lived experience. For example, a woman of color in STEM may face both racial and gender bias, which shapes her experiences differently from those of her white or male peers. While the concept of intersectionality has existed for a relatively long time, the term itself was coined by Kimberly Crenshaw in her 1989 paper titled Demarginalizing the Intersection of Race and Sex. In this paper, she analyzes how anti-discrimination law and even feminist and anti-racist activism often rely on what she calls a single-axis framework. That means they tend to look at discrimination through only one lens at a time, like race or gender, but not both together. And Crenshaw argues that this single axis approach leads to the erasure of people whose experiences exist at the intersection, like Black women. And to expose this limitation, Crenshaw analyzes the 1976 DeGraffenreid v. General Motors case. So in this case, 5 Black women brought forward a complaint that General Motors, GM, was discriminating against them specifically as Black women. The court applied a single-axis analysis in which it looked at discrimination against race and sex separately. It found no race discrimination because GM hired Black men and no sex discrimination because GM hired white women, and both groups were doing relatively well. So the court concluded that there was no discrimination at all. So in this framework, Black women are only protected to the extent that their experiences coincide with those of either Black men or white women. Thus, their intersectional experience of race and gender was denied by the court. And Crenshaw uses a traffic intersection analogy to really help clarify this. She asks us to imagine someone standing in the middle of an intersection where cars can come from all directions, north, south, east, and west. If a person is hit, the harm could come from one direction or from multiple directions at once. In the same way, a Black woman who stands at the intersection of both race and gender may experience discrimination that stems from both racism and sexism simultaneously. The key insight is that the harm a Black woman faces cannot be fully understood by examining race or gender in isolation. And this is something the court failed to recognize in the DeGraffenreid v. General Motors case. So in short, think of intersectionality is like being at a busy intersection of multiple systems of oppression. You can get hit from any direction or even more critically, all of them at once. We need to move away from a single axis approach and recognize that oppression often operates on a multiple intersecting axis. So why is intersectionality a vital lens to analyze politics? One way to understand its importance is by looking at the long-standing race versus class debate. This debate centers on whether race or class is a more influential factor in shaping political behavior and which one should be prioritized in political strategy. So on the one hand, scholars like William Wilson argue that class has become more influential than race when we consider African Americans' life chances, which refers to the opportunities and possibilities individuals have to improve their quality of life or achieve success. And he points to the growth of the Black middle class and advocates for more class-based policies. But on the other hand, political scientist Michael Dawson pushes back, arguing that race remains a critical factor regardless of socioeconomic status. He introduces the concept of link fate, where the idea is that an individual believes their well-being is tied to the well-being of their racial group. And he finds link fate, particularly in the Black community, to remain strong. Thus, this shows how race continues or can continue to shape political behavior even across class lines. But here's the thing. Viewing race and class as a binary, like an either or, is fundamentally limiting. It ignores how race and class intersect to shape people's lived realities in complex ways. These lived realities can shape a person's relationship to politics and how they engage in politics. Now, if you're in STEM, think of it like analyzing a system with only one variable versus running a multivariable model. You wouldn't try to explain the behavior of a complex system using just a single factor. So why should we approach social and political analysis that way? Intersectionality gives us a more comprehensive framework where we can account for different forces like race, class, and gender, and how they interact and compound on one another. Take, for example, how broad racial categories can mask important differences. In 2012, the Pew Research Center produced a report titled The Rise of the Asian Americans. This report painted a picture of Asian Americans as a uniformly successful and satisfied group, like the model minority. But Asian American scholars were quick to criticize it for glossing over socioeconomic struggles of subgroups like the Hmong, Cambodian, and Laotian communities, groups that face disproportionately high poverty rates and low educational attainment. And these critiques highlight exactly why an intersectionality lens is so necessary. It pushes us to ask whose experiences are being centered, who gets left out of the narrative. While wealthier Asian subgroups may align more closely with the report's finding, those at the intersection of racial and economic marginalization are rendered invisible. So rather than treating race and class as a separate or competing forces, intersectionality helps us to see how they work together. It gives a more accurate, a more nuanced understanding of political behavior and identity, and it helps us avoid the trap of reinforcing stereotypes or generalizations about entire communities. And this brings us to the next important point, challenging homogeneous and universalizing ideas. Intersectional analysis pushes back against the tendency to group people in singular sweeping categories, like the woman's experience, or the Black experience, or like the Pew Research report did, the Asian American experience. Too often, these broad narratives end up reflecting the perspectives of the most privileged members within those groups. For instance, white women are often centered in feminism, while Black men dominate anti racist narratives, leaving out those who experience overlapping forms of oppression. And adding on to this, Mutsuye Yamada, a Japanese American poet, feminist, and human rights activist, has spoken about how Asian Pacific American women are often expected to speak on behalf of an entire community whenever issues of race and gender come up in the feminist movement. But that expectation assumes that there's a single monolithic experience, when in reality, the Asian Pacific American community is incredibly diverse. Different cultures, different histories, different class backgrounds, all that shape how people experience the world. So asking one person to represent the whole is not only unfair, it also flattens those differences. Now let's talk about something that often comes up in conversations about justice and equality, and that is law and legal reform. At first glance, passing laws that protect marginalized groups might seem like the obvious path to liberation. But Dean Spade, a trans activist and legal scholar, offers an important critique of this approach. Spade argues that relying on legal reform as the primary strategy for justice is fundamentally limited. Sure, things like hate crime laws or anti discrimination policies might offer symbolic inclusion, but they don't necessarily get at the root causes of violence and marginalization that trans people, especially those who are poor and of color, face daily. And here's where intersectionality really sharpens our understanding. Spade points out that the legal system itself, particularly things like immigration enforcement, criminal law, and even welfare eligibility processes, is often the very sources of harm for marginalized communities. These are not just flawed systems, they are, in his words, extremely violent and targeted. That's why legal reform, while sometimes can be helpful, can also become a distraction. It can pull forces and resources away from the more urgent, life sustaining needs, like access to housing, healthcare, and protection from police and state violence. So, how can we use an intersectional lens to build a more effective political strategy? To push for liberation, we need to center the experiences and amplify the voices of the most marginalized. In other words, this is known as the bottom-up approach. For instance, in an interview, Beth Ritchie, who is the co-founder of the Violence Intervention Program in East Harlem, which, by the way, is one of the first programs run by women of color, she points to the need to center the experience and struggles of the most marginalized individuals and communities when combating systemic violence. And these are often women of color, poor women, and women with disabilities. The author posits the addressing needs of those at the cutting edge of multiple oppressions would necessitate broad societal changes that would benefit everyone. And similar to this, Dean Spade pushes for the bottom-up approach to trans politics. Spade points out that when movements prioritize the least vulnerable members of a targeted group, and the so-called victories usually don't trickle down to the most impacted. And this applies not just to trans politics, but also to feminism and anti-racist movements too. When these efforts center more privileged voices like white middle-class individuals or black men, they often fail to deliver real change for those most oppressed. Spade points is powerful. If we start by fighting for those at the bottom, we build a foundation that lifts everyone up. The reverse just does not work. But are there some challenges in trying to create an intersectional approach to political issues? Yes, intersectionality isn't always easy to implement. The Combahee River Collective, which is a pioneering Black feminist group, was clear about this. They pointed out that organizing across different identities can be complicated. For example, within the Black community, feminism is sometimes seen as threatening because it challenges traditional gender roles. Some Black men may resist Black feminism, fearing it could divide the community or force them to confront their own sexist behaviors. Then there's the challenge of centering the most marginalized. Like all the scholars and Kimberly Crenshaw, they argue adopting a bottom-up approach, but where the most marginalized voices are prioritized and can benefit everyone. But this isn't always easy in practice. It requires rethinking the entire framework of how we do politics. It means shifting away from the dominant voices and narratives that have traditionally shaped political agendas. However, in many movements, those with more privilege tend to have more access, more resources, more visibility, and more control over the conversation. But with that said, the main takeaway I want you to grab out of this is that identity isn't simple and oppression isn't simple. It's also not homogeneous or monolithic. Things like race, gender, class, sexuality, ability, nationality, and more, all these things don't just exist in separate boxes. They intersect, they overlap, they shape each other, and they profoundly shape our experiences, opportunities, and our relationship to politics and power. Traditional approaches that isolate these factors can distort our understanding and lead to solutions that just don't work for everyone, or worse, reinforce the very inequalities they're meant to challenge. In STEM, when you want to reduce bias in your studies, you account for multiple variables to better understand a system. Intersectionality does the same thing but with people's lives. It's a framework that helps us see the fuller picture. Whether we're analyzing how anti-discrimination law fails Black women, why broad racial categories overlook economic disparities, or how even well-intentioned reforms can reproduce harm, intersectionality helps us ask better questions. Whose voices are we hearing? Who's being left out? And perhaps more importantly, who are we centering in our strategies for change? For those of you in STEM, think of intersectionality as a system-thinking approach to justice. The more variables we account for, the more accurate and inclusive our solutions can be. And that's what I'm going to leave you with today. Thank you for listening.